Shall I just launch straight in, or yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, hi, well, I'm John Taylor. I'm going to talk about Plutarch's life of Alcibiades. The slides are really just so that you don't have to look at me all the time. Mad, Bad and Dangerous to Know, the title that I was given, was actually said of the Romantic poet Lord Byron, but it fits Alcibiades pretty well. Byron has been described as the first modern celebrity. He was a brilliant but wild and wayward aristocrat who sat loose to convention and spent much of his life on the run from scandal. He swam the Hellespont, where some of Alcibiades' campaigns took place. He died far from home, fighting for Greece in the War of Independence. Who was Alcibiades? Well, the preeminent celebrity of classical Greece. Aristotle, writing a century later, says that poetry deals with universals, the sort of things that could happen, whereas history is about particulars, what Alcibiades did or what happened to him. Aristotle surely picked him because his life was packed with extraordinary incidents. A good book on Alcibiades by the late Peter Rhodes has as its subtitle, Athenian Playboy, General and Traitor, and that just about sums him up. He lived in interesting times, and his adult life coincided with the 27-year Peloponnesian War. Wars grew out of earlier wars, and in Greek literature, accounts of wars look back to accounts of earlier wars. It all goes back to Homer, composing the Iliad probably in the 8th century, about the Trojan War in the 12th. As Alcibiades was growing up, Herodotus was writing about another East-West conflict, the Persian Wars of half a century earlier, showing that mighty heroic deeds didn't just belong to the distant past. Most of the Greek city-states cooperated uneasily to fend off the big expedition led by Xerxes. Sparta exercised nominal command, but a lot of the initiative came from Athens. After the war, many of the allies regrouped under Athens to maintain resistance to Persia in a league that gradually turned into an Athenian empire. This put the wind up Sparta and her allies in the Peloponnese, especially Athens' commercial rival Corinth, and by mid-century there were skirmishes in central Greece, sometimes referred to as the First Peloponnesian War. The 30 Years' Peace of 446 seemed to end Athenian territorial ambitions on the mainland, but Athens' grip on her subject allies, mainly islands and coastal cities in Ionia, modern Turkey, continued to tighten. The two power blocks, Sparta's blue on the map, Athens' red, confronted each other, and after provocative preliminaries, the main Peloponnesian War got going with the invasion of Attica in 421. It was recorded by Thucydides, one of the great historians of all time, even though we no longer take at face value his carefully created air of magisterial and impartial authority. He tells us he realised from its outset that the war was going to be important, and he took part in it as an Athenian general, so in our terms it's current affairs rather than history. He was exiled in 424 for failing to stop the northern city of Amphipolis falling into enemy hands. The Athenian Democratic Assembly could be ruthless. But exile enabled him to talk to participants on both sides, probably including Alcibiades. At any rate, he is our most important primary source for what Alcibiades did. His account of the war breaks off in 411, but he certainly lived beyond 404 and knew about the defeat of Athens. Several other authors took up the story from about this point. Xenophon's Hellenica, Greek Affairs, starts in 411 and continues for another half century. The first part of it is our second major source for Alcibiades. Finally, among near contemporary accounts is the portrait of Alcibiades in Plato's Symposium. More on this in a minute. We'll also look at a contemporary reference in Aristophanes, and mention should be made of a brief biography in Latin written by Cornelius Nepos in the 1st century BC. Most, if not all, of these sources, and others now lost, will have been known to our spotlighted author, Plutarch. Who was Plutarch? Well, he was a Roman Greek, writing about 500 years after Alcibiades and most of the authors we've mentioned so far. A rough equivalent would be a modern historian or historical novelist writing about Thomas Cromwell. But being a Roman Greek means much more than just living in Roman times. Plutarch was steeped in two cultures and personifies the relationship between them. The independent city-states of classical Greece were a distant memory. Most were taken over first by Macedon, then, after Alexander, incorporated into Hellenistic kingdoms. These in turn became Roman provinces, and by Plutarch's time, most of the Greek world had been part of one province or another for well over a century. Plutarch ushers in a great age of Greek revival involving nostalgia and self-assertion, but not resentment or rebelliousness. He lived and wrote in his hometown of Chaeronea in central Greece and served assiduously as a priest at Delphi. But he also taught and lectured in Rome and had influential friends there. He was a prolific author, philosopher, historian, essayist. He's most famous for his parallel lives, pairs of biographies putting a Greek figure alongside a Roman in some way equivalent, usually with explicit comparison in a short appendix. Alcibiades is paired with the Roman Coriolanus, familiar from Shakespeare. I'll come back to that at the end. Nepos starts his biography by saying no one excelled Alcibiades in either vices or virtues. That's an overstatement, but it's true that he didn't do things by heart. Plutarch is more subtle, making moral qualities or their absence a main focus in his lives. Many of his readers would be familiar with Thucydides. Plutarch enjoys filling out the picture. He's a readable author and was much read from the Renaissance onwards. In this country, a landmark was Thomas North's translation of 1580, shown in the picture, which Shakespeare used. Classicists and ancient historians used to disparage Plutarch, and students were reprimanded for relying on his testimony. More recently, his stature has increased. His skill as a writer is admired, and it is acknowledged that he preserves valuable material we wouldn't otherwise have. He names his sources mainly when he disagrees with them, but even unattributed told tales have value. That they were circulated is itself an historical fact. Alcibiades was born with a silver spoon. His mother was an Alcmeonid, i.e. a member of the family which, though blighted by an hereditary curse, had dominated Athenian politics in earlier decades. His father Cleinias had both financed a trireme and fought in the Battle of Artemisium in 480, and was killed at Coronea in 447 in one of the mid-century skirmishes. The toddler Alcibiades was then transferred to the household of his mother's close relative Pericles, the statesman of whom Thucydides said that though Athens was in name a democracy, it was becoming the rule of one man. Plutarch comments on the degree of detail he had available about Alcibiades, including the names of his nurse and his tutor, whereas for other major statesmen, not even their mother's name was recorded. Ancient authors usually see stories of childhood as foreshadowing the subject's adult life. Think, for instance, of the gospel story of Jesus at the age of 12 in discussion with learned teachers in the temple. Plutarch offers a rather odd selection about Alcibiades. Here and later, one anecdote follows another without much comment. We might wonder whether this bitterness indicates failure to control teeming material. But Chris Pelling, in the current Omnibus magazine, which I recommend, argues that the barrage of stories deliberately shows Alcibiades as a complex and unpredictable figure. Of the three specifically childhood stories, the first has him bite his opponent in a wrestling bout. When accused of biting like a woman, he retorts, "No, like a lion." So, a spin doctor who ignores the rules. Next, a game of knucklebones in a narrow street. A loaded wagon approaches. His companions scatter, but Alcibiades defies the man to drive over him. So, a bluff caller. The third has him refuse to learn the aulos, a popular wind instrument, because it would distort his features. The instrument's popularity promptly plummeted. So, a self-admiring influencer. This leads to the recurrent theme of Alcibiades' physical beauty and attracting of male admirers. He treats most of these with disdain, having eyes only for the middle-aged and famously ugly Socrates. There were some very talented people in Athens in the later 5th century, and the city was small enough for most of them to know each other. We have no texts written by Socrates, but names in the history of philosophy don't come much bigger than his. Earlier thinkers, interested mainly in what we would call natural science, are categorized as pre-Socratics. It was Socrates who refocused the subject to concentrate on the linked areas of moral philosophy, how we should behave, and epistemology, how we know anything. Despite his perceived oddity and the persecution he later incurred, Socrates was a loyal citizen of Athens, leaving the city only on military service, where we first hear of him with Alcibiades, sharing a tent at Potidaea in northern Greece in 432 in the run-up to the war. Socrates saves the life of the wounded Alcibiades. They fight alongside each other again at the Battle of Delium in central Greece in 424, where the favour is reciprocated. In Plato's Symposium, a fictionalised description of a drinking party set in 416 BC, the discussion of the nature of love is interrupted by the arrival of a drunk Alcibiades, who eulogises the inner rather than physical beauty of Socrates, his wisdom and intelligence, and describes the failure of his own attempt at seduction, unusual in being initiated by the younger man. Alcibiades married Hipparete, daughter of the extremely wealthy Hipponicus, despite getting off to a bad start by thumping his future father-in-law for a laugh. Her money no doubt extended the reach of an already extravagant lifestyle. His philandering led her to appear in public, unusually for an Athenian woman, to file for divorce. But when Alcibiades turned up and physically carried her back home, the idea was dropped. We're next told he chopped off his dog's tail so people could gossip about that instead of saying worse things about him. But the dominant impression remains that of a show-off who would have agreed with Oscar Wilde that the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. At his first appearance in the Athenian Assembly, he forgot, or pretended to forget, that he had a pet quail under his cloak. It escaped, and everyone chased after it. It was caught by Antiochus, who became a friend, but would later get him into trouble. A slight speech impediment and halting delivery only increased his charm. He pursued the rich man's hobby of horse breeding, entering an unprecedented 7 racing chariots in the Olympics, probably those of 416 BC, and winning first, second, and fourth prizes. The games were an interstate arena, and we're told that other cities vied to fund his entertainment on a grand scale. But the account ends more sourly when he buys a chariot for a friend, but enters it as his own. Moral scruple doesn't feature. Moral scruple, traditional piety, and conservative caution almost defined Nicias, who from the late 420s became Alcibiades' main rival. The first 10 years of the war had been largely a stalemate, pitting the sea power of Athens against the land power of the Peloponnesians, neither keen for direct confrontation on the other's element. The deaths in 422 of the hawkish leaders on each side, the Athenian Cleon and the Spartan Brasidas, left the way open for the negotiated peace of Nicias the following year. It was never stable. Alcibiades resented Nicias' popularity outside Athens, despite his own hereditary role in looking after the interests of Spartans in his own city. And his whole mindset was restlessly imperialist. Indeed, an implicit theme throughout Plutarch's biography is that Alcibiades represents the character and aspiration of his city. He was instrumental in forming an anti-Spartan alliance with Argos, and fighting resumed even though the peace remained nominally in force. Alcibiades was not alone in casting covetous eyes on Sicily, often as a springboard to possible further future conquests further in the west or into North Africa, for example, Carthage. Sicily becomes the next big focus. That would bring Nicias and Alcibiades more closely together. But the contrast between them is more complex than it seems. Neither was a typical politician at this date, in the way that Cleon had been. He was one of the so-called new politicians, castigated by conservative sources as demagogues, not the oiks caricatured in Aristophanes, but representing new money from manufacturing and different in style from traditional aristocrats. Cleon had a successor in Hyperbolus, whom Nicias and Alcibiades temporarily joined forces to make the victim, instead of one of themselves, of an ostracism, the last use of this device whereby a powerful politician was sent into honourable exile for 10 years. The picture shows a potsherd, the ancient equivalent of scrap paper, with part of Alcibiades' name and his father's. Nicias had the manner of a traditional grandee, yet he too represented new money. His father hired out gangs of slaves to work in the silver mines. Alcibiades was at once patrician and populist, competing for support in a changed world. These two, Nicias against his will, were appointed, along with the same professional soldier Lamachus, to lead the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. Thucydides inherited from Herodotus the convention that the more elaborate are human preparations and their description, the more surely we know that they will fail. In his account of debates over Sicily and the expedition's departure, it immediately follows Athens' harsh treatment of the small island of Melos, which had resisted incorporation into the Athenian Empire. There is in Thucydides no explicit theological dimension, but readers would recognise a pattern of hubris followed by nemesis. Plutarch supplements a justly celebrated narrative. The first bad omen was the festival of Adonis, where women's laments for the young dying god were heard as foreshadowing losses in Sicily. Mutilation of the Hermes, stone pillars with the head of the messenger god Hermes and an erect phallus, a familiar part of Athenian street furniture, seemed directly provocative of divine reprisal, and subsequent investigation uncovered stories of a different religious scandal, mock celebrations in private houses of the sacred and secret Eleusinian mysteries into which many Athenians were initiated. The second picture shows the ceremony, with Alcibiades said to be involved. Hijinks of this sort would be entirely in character. It's less likely he stooped to common vandalism, but the two things were inevitably linked in popular indignation. They were also associated with aspiration to tyranny, i.e. one-man rule achieved by a coup, fashionable in Greece in the previous 2 centuries. It's hard to know how serious a threat this remained, but because radical democracy was in effect the establishment, any regime change could only come from restriction of democratic rights. Again, Alcibiades is seen as trying to act outside and above the system. His reasonable request to stand trial before the expedition left was refused, and off it went. But a change of mind soon followed, and the state ship Salaminia was dispatched to recall him. The crew caught up with Alcibiades before he'd had chance to do much in Sicily, but they'd been instructed to use a velvet glove, and after leaving under escort, he unsurprisingly jumped ship and made his way to Sparta. Here he ingratiated himself, adapting readily to Spartan austerity and advising his hosts to send their highly competent commander Gylippus to Sicily and to establish a fortress at Decelia in Attica to impede Athenian food supply. Both things were done and caused Athens considerable damage. It is here that he seems most obviously a traitor, though we should remember that both he and Nicias had previously been friends of Sparta, and this was a world where allegiances constantly changed. At any rate, Alcibiades soon blotted his copybook by seducing the wife of the Spartan king Agis, and was on the run again under threat of death from his just now Spartan friends. He made his way to the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, governor of what is now Western Turkey, and wheedled his way into his affections. By this stage in the war, both sides were keen to get Persian money, Tissaphernes having hitherto helped Sparta. By this time, too, Athenian forces were concentrated on the island of Samos. Alcibiades contacted their leaders, hinting that funds might be forthcoming from Tissaphernes, and regime change in Athens might help. After some manoeuvring, a short-lived oligarchic regime was indeed established in Athens, but at this point, the chameleon Alcibiades changed again, accepting summons from the Athenian troops in Samos, the democracy in exile, and appointment by them as general. They also wanted him to lead them straight to Athens and overthrow the oligarchs. Plutarch judges that he showed true leadership in resisting this, which would have let the Eastern Aegean fall into enemy hands and would have fomented civil war in Athens, making the explicit comment, "There is no doubt that he saved the Athenian Empire." Despite the Sicilian disaster and subsequent upheavals in Athens and the empire, the Athenians fought on for another 9 years, and for a time seemed likely still to win the war. This was largely thanks to the leadership of Alcibiades, particularly in winning a major naval battle at Cyzicus in northwest Asia Minor in 410. Already before Cyzicus, the restored democracy in Athens had called for the return of Alcibiades, and after further successes at Chalcedon and Byzantium, he finally returned in triumph in 407. He was enthusiastically greeted, previous curses against him were annulled, and he was granted an unprecedented supreme command with power over his fellow generals. And he staged a major propaganda coup by restoring, under military surveillance, the procession from Athens to Eleusis for the Mysteries, which had been impossible since the Spartan occupation of Decelia. This made amends for his earlier irreverence. But it was too good to last. People noticed that Alcibiades had returned on an ill-omened day when a statue of Athena from the Acropolis was ritually purified and business was suspended. Fear of a dictatorship continued to surface, even as Alcibiades was being granted all he wanted. Returning to the eastern seaboard, he failed to achieve the expected further run of successes. The new Spartan commander Lysander was using Persian money to raise his sailors' pay. While Alcibiades was away raising his own funds, the helmsman Antiochus, the one who caught the quail, left in charge of his fleet, disobeyed orders, and provoked the enemy to fight, leading to a major defeat at Notium near Ephesus in 406. An opponent of Alcibiades within the army sailed to Athens to denounce him, and replacement generals were appointed. Alcibiades withdrew to Thrace and set about recruiting his own mercenaries. At Aedos Potami in the Hellespont in 405, his advice that the Athenians were stationed in the wrong place was rebuffed, and they were defeated in this final battle of the war. Early in 404, the victorious Lysander captured Athens, burned her fleet, and demolished her walls. The city was handed over to a narrow oligarchy, the so-called 30 tyrants. The Athenians regretted having thrown Alcibiades aside, but lived in hope of another return. It was not to be. Alcibiades, in fear of the Spartans, had fled to Pharnabazdas, satrap of the Hellespont region, that he, on Lysander's orders, had him killed. In January 405, Aristophanes put on his most famous comedy, Frogs, where Dionysus, the god of theatre, goes down to the underworld to get back a dead tragic playwright. This leads to a contest between the traditionalist Aeschylus and the avant-garde Euripides. Near the end of this literary play, they are asked a political question and promise that whoever gives the better answer will return to Earth. The question is about Alcibiades. Dionysus says the Athenians can't decide about him. They long for him, they hate him, they can't do without him. Euripides replies, I hate a citizen who is slow to help his city, quick to cause her harm, who's got his eyes wide open to anything that helps himself, but completely shut when it comes to helping the city. Aeschylus replies more pithily and enigmatically, it's better not to rear a lion in the city, but if you do, you better obey his every whim. Aeschylus wins. Finally, Plutarch's Syncrisis, the judging together of Alcibiades and Coriolanus. The Roman hero, whose historicity is now doubted, supposedly lived about 500 BC. He owed his surname to his defeat of the Volscians, enemies of Rome, at their capital Corioli. But he was less successful in politics than on the battlefield, being haughty towards the common people and unwilling to help them in a famine. Rejected and exiled, he took refuge with the Volscians and joined them for war against his own people. Embassies from Rome had no effect, but when his mother and wife led a delegation of Roman women, he agreed to withdraw and lived in exile until his death. Plutarch unusually here puts the Roman life first. This may be partly because Coriolanus is earlier in date, but the main reason is that he is in contrast to Alcibiades, a one-dimensional character, signally lacking the people skills that Alcibiades had in abundance and that brought him through his multiple adventures to the end.